In this lecture series, we discuss about authentication. We will discuss how users are authenticated by computers and service providers. We will discuss the risks of using weak passwords and how to protect them. As an overview, these are the topics that we are going to discuss. We will define what identification is, what authentication is, 3 types of attack scenarios, weak authentication scheme, password attacks, followed by hardened password, and last but not least, what strong authentication is. Let us start with identification and authentication. Identification is about who are you. Authentication is about are you who you say you are. To define it more precisely, identification is the act of asserting who the subject is. Authentication is the act of proving that asserted identity, that is, the subject is who it says it really is. Notice the term that I use when I'm defining identification and authentication. I use the term subject rather than a person, because subjects can be people, but it can also be computer processes, executing programs, or even network communications, devices, and similar active entities. Let's look at what can be identities to be used as identification process. Identities are things by which people and service provider can identify you. They are often well-known, public knowledge, and they are not protected. For example, like name, bank account number, debit card number, email address, and so on. Because when you are sending an email to someone, you are implicitly telling the email recipient your email account ID. When you are buying certain things online using your credit card number, you are revealing your credit card information. So those are identities. Those are not some secrets. And we use those identities so that other people could easily identify you. But on the other hand, those other people could also easily claim to be you by presenting one of your known identities. And that's where authentications come in to prevent such things from happening. Authentication has to be private and necessarily protected. Since anyone could claim to be you by presenting your identity, authentication helps verify that the one presenting your identity is really you. As such, authentication has to be strong enough to be secure, obviously. Quiz question for you. Think about digital certificate. Is digital certificate a form of authentication? If yes, what is the private information that is to be protected? Authentication mechanisms. They typically use any of these following 3 qualities to confirm a user's identity, something the user knows, like passwords, PIN number, your mother's maiden name, and so on. Something that you know. Or something that you are, like physical characteristics of you, like fingerprints, voice pattern, face, and so on. Or something that you have, like access card, cryptographic key, private key, public key, or digital certificate. So among which you already know that passwords is the one that is the most commonly used. And as such, we will discuss about the attack associated with passwords a little bit later. Before discussing about password attack, let me complete explaining about authentication mechanism. In authentication, there are 2 phases. Firstly, the user Bob has to register his ID and password information to Alice. So that Alice can store Bob credential information in some kind of a file, or it could also be a database. And in this phase, the underlying assumption is that this registration is secure. And this security can be achieved by means of communication security that we discussed during our first few lectures. And as such, I assume that you know how you can achieve secure communication already at this point. But here we are assuming that. We want to focus more on the authentication phase. So after Bob has registered his ID and password, then whenever he wants to log into the Alice server, he will reveal his ID and he will reveal or prove that he knows the password to Alice so that she can verify the revealed information against the password stored in the password file. And in this context here, we are assuming that this authentication phase is subject to attacks. Depending on how Bob reveals his password, there are two types of authentication methods: weak authentication and strong authentication. When we are using weak authentication scheme, the user, Bob, reveals the password S to Alice. Here, notice the term I'm using to represent the secret S. Instead of using the same symbol K that is what we use during the lectures when we discuss about confidentiality, integrity, and digital certificates. Here we are using S because unlike K, we are not doing any kinds of encryption here anymore. We are not encrypting, we are not signing or whatsoever. So here the secret is just a secret information like a password. So that's why here I'm using the symbol S to denote the secret information. So in weak authentication, Bob will reveal S to Alice. And strong authentication, Bob does not reveal S to Alice. Instead, he proved to Alice that he knows S. Here, let me bring us more precisely into the context. When I'm talking about Alice, think about whether Alice is really a person or not. Think about this scenario. When you are trying to log into an SMU account, for example, Elan, what is or who is Bob? What is Alice? Bob is a real human being, like people like me, like us, like you. It could be faculty, it could be students who is trying to log in to use SMU services. But when we are talking about Alice, Alice is not a real human being. Whenever we are trying to log into the SMU system, there is no a real human being waiting to authenticate you in. Instead, it is a program stored inside the web server of SMU, and those programs will be checking your password and identity credentials. So here, when I means Alice, in fact, it actually means a computer program running inside a web server or running inside a computer. So to put things more clearly, let us define a bit more precisely. In this authentication lecture, we will assume that user could authenticate to either a local device, a laptop, for example, or a remote server, or a website. There are three possibilities. And user authentication is done through a software, and that software we will refer to it as client side. And those local device, remote server, or website that the user is trying to log into is referred to as a server side. And in the local device setting, client side, the software could be a login screen of your personal computer because this is a local device setting. Whereas server side is your Unix or Windows operating system. In the remote setting, client side is a login interface software running on your local computer, and server side is the Unix or Windows operating system running in that remote server. Lastly, in the website setting, client side is a web browser, and server side is a website. So to recap, in this mini lecture, we defined identification. We defined authentication. We discussed about the three qualities that are typically used in authentication process. And there are two phases involved in the authentication process: registration and authentication. And lastly, we define weak authentication and strong authentication. And now that we have properly defined authentication, in the next lecture series, we will discuss about attack scenarios. Thank you very much. See you next time.